Welcome to the second lecture. We are going to talk about three-layer architecture and how these are implemented for the backend application. We will be using Python for today, but it doesn't really matter which programming language you use. The principles are working the same way. Our focus for today is going to be create, retrieve, update, and delete for user entity. The next lecture will be about roles and authentication, how it all fits to three-layer model. But today we will make the framework, the basis of our application, so it will actually provide the necessary functionality. And let's start our implementation by creating a model. So we are going to create some kind of an entity. So what data this entity can have? And I think that the first entity that we're going to create is obviously a user, and it can have, for example, a username, first name, second name, and a role. And role is necessary because we're having some intrusive and non-intrusive operations. So, for example, we don't want any user to be able to delete any other user. So we want to have a kind of administrator user which can delete some other users. And for this, we're going to have a regular user role and administrator role. So now we're ready to start with our implementation. Our first step would be to implement the model of our application. So model is a noun in the REST API sense, things that we can create in our REST API service. User in our case, but it can be, let's say, pizza order, pizza type, this sort of thing. And unlike domain-driven development, the model that we're going to create will have no behavior, just data and parameters. And the behavior is going to be created by services, verbs in REST API sense. This approach is more functional programming-like and less object-oriented-like, but I still think it is way easier to test and think in this sense when you are creating a REST API. Alright, so we start with actually quite empty Python repository. But there are a couple of things that I would like to discuss first. So, well, obviously we're going to use virtual environment. I'm using Visual Studio Code for editing, but you can use whatever you want. And there is some gitignore file. Nothing special, but pay attention to the high-level structure. I have already created three main submodules in my project. One is business, and that's where the business layer is going to be stored. The other one is persistence for persistence layer. And finally, presentation layer. We are going to start with the model implementation, which is the business layer. So I'm basically creating just new module here and call it model. And in order to make this folder a model, we need to add a init.py file. Okay, and we can also create a init.py here. Py. Right, be good. Now that's is necessary because without this, many Python implementation will not consider a folder as a valid Python module. Okay, so now we have our model and we can create our first class, which is going to be user. User Py. So we agreed that the user is going to have several things. It is going to have whatever it is, self. Yeah, so it is having first username. Let it be just public. And that's equals none. It is going to have first name, which is also not defined for yet. First, let's fix the typo. Then it's going to have last name, and it is going to have role. Now for the role, I also would like to create a new class for this. And let me just add it as a new file. Let's say role py. And here we're going to have class role. And it's going to have, just for now, let's say just a name. Self role name. None looks good. And we're going to define. Okay. Now our model is created, so we can actually do something about our user. So that's where we are now. Right now we have only created a part of the business layer, which is model, user and role classes. Since we are not going to use role, I will not draw this on this diagram. Now the thing is, most of the patterns that we discuss, architectural patterns, I mean like 3-layer, hexagonal, clean architecture, they are coming from words like Java and C#, where they have static typing and reliance on the interface. When we write in the code in Python and in more dynamic languages, we have to choose. Either we are going to expose some kind of an interface, or we're going to let the dynamic language to do the work for ourselves. Oh wait, never mind that. Going back to the implementation, the first thing that we're going to implement is create user. But there's a little problem. When you are creating user, we would like to write automated tests for this because we are responsible programmers. But if you create user, it is very difficult to create end-to-end tests for this. So for the end-to-end acceptance test, we will just have to create and retrieve user as a part of a single test. I just don't see any better way around this. So, well, let's start with that. So the first functionality that we're going to implement is going to be create and retrieve user. So let's start with a very simple test, and I'm just created a really dummy stub test case in unit test, and using unit test Python library. You can use PyTest or whatever it is. I just use unit test, so I don't need to add any new dependencies. And what we need to do, we need to be able to call a user service, and the user service will be our main class on the business layer, which is providing a functionality related to user. So we need to be able to create and retrieve user. Okay, so what we need to do, we need to create user service. And that's the first thing that is going to fail. We don't have any user service yet. So let's say user service equals user service. We don't have this. That's why it's complaining. And now we need to create a user, which we're going to pass as a model. And then user service create user would take a user as an input, and then user service create user hopefully will return us a user ID in some form, and then we should be able to retrieve user. So let's say retrieved user, and then we should be able to check that user that we created is the same as retrieved user. At least that's how I think we could start. Now we need to make this happen. We need to make this test path. No need to run this because it's going to fail. We don't have a user service yet. Well, this is fairly easy to fix. Let's create a user service. Py, and this one is going to have class called user service. Should be good enough for now. So let me just use split screen here. I can hide this. I can hide that as well. So that's my user service. Good. Now I need to import this. Be good. We need to import a user model. This is not going to pass for many other reasons. One of them is that the user that we have created, it doesn't have any fields. So I think it can be fixed on the constructor layer, for example. And let's say we are providing the username, first name, last name, but we are not providing the role. Let's say role is regular, hard-coded for now. That is because we're going to handle all the roles in the next lection. Okay, so going here, it should start complaining, and it's not complaining, not sure why. But never mind that. Let's just provide the required data. So let's say username is going to be user, yeah. Last name user works for me. All good. And let's say we want to have another field which is known by default, but when I'm getting a user from the database, I want the user ID to be not none. So yeah, that's user ID, and let's say self assert equal retrieved user retrieved user ID and the user ID that we got. Yeah, that looks like a nice test. Let's add the stub method here. So we're going to have the, let me just rename this. I like to put test at the end of the class name. User service test is sound better than test user service, at least for me. Okay. Now we can run this, which is obviously failing. And let's see what it says. If method is not known. Not quite sure what it says, to be honest. Like, okay. Failed with error. User service init missing one. Okay, that's because init is asking for more than we care to provide. Error. Yeah, that's fine. Now it is. It should still fail, but the error should be different. It should fail because we are not returning anything. Yeah, that's what it's complaining about. We are returning none, and it is expecting not done, which is a good progress. Now, when we created those methods, we essentially created a contract. So we are saying that user should be user. And let's just import this. And we're returning int as a user ID. And get user takes int and returns user. So that's our contract, that's our interface that we are going to expose to other layer. Now let's think what we need to do. In order to be able to save the user, we need to have some kind of data storage And it doesn't really matter what data storage it is. For now, let's just use a dictionary as a storage, and let's call this in-memory storage. So now we are going to the persistence layer, and we are creating a storage. New file, and let's say a storage py. Now we're going to have, let's say, a use class called user storage. And it can def save user, and it can get, well, actually, why we repeat ourselves? It can just save. It is understandable that it is saving user, and it can get, yeah. And I'm not sure if it's going to return int. So let's just miss this for now. And instead of pass, we will just throw no implemented, which is not throw but raise in Python. So we created another semi-interface. And now we're going to implement this. Let's say we're going to have in-memory storage py, which implements this interface. So it is class in memory storage, and it takes our storage as the parent class. Okay, so that's what we have here. So we have a list, just empty list for a start. Then when we try to get user, we just return a list element by index. And when we save user, we are just getting the length of the list and storing it as the index and just adding this. So yeah, here actually it should be append. That should be better. Okay. And that's pretty much it. What you're complaining about? Ah, because it's called not storage, it's called user storage. Okay. So now it is all right. We have added an import. And we have our in-memory storage, which we can use for test. So now in the... Oh, we need to say fix those errors as well. That's fine. So what we need to do now in our business layer is just to use user repository. Now, what the thing is that our business layer does not need to know what kind of, well, storage we use. So let me open the user service. Here it is. Let's say when I create it here, I have the self storage. Yeah, user storage. And that is in memory user storage, at least for now. And now I can use it. So self user storage, save user, and it should return the user ID. Now I see a small problem here. Our save doesn't return anything. Return user ID. Now it is fixed. Let's see what user storage. Yeah, it is not yet returning anything. So we need to update the contract. So it is going to return user ID. And now close the storage, going here. The get is also very simple. We just return this. Return self user storage, get user ID. Not much logic here. And for now, you can wonder like why I have created this business layer, why I'm saying it is important, while most of the logic is happening in the persistence, at least for now. But just let's wait and see how our code is going to evolve over time, and then hopefully it will be becoming more apparent why I think it's a good idea. The one thing, yeah, I also would like to check that user ID is not none, just to double check. Assert equal, assert, yeah. And we're going to run our test, which should hopefully pass now, and it doesn't. Why? Yeah, no, it is passing. I just needed to run it twice. Okay, that's probably some synchronization issue. So now we can create user, and we can get user data, but we cannot yet do this using an API. So let's fix this. All right, so for the API implementation, I'm going to use Flask. It doesn't matter what kind of framework you're going to use for the API implementation, but I just more proficient and used to Flask, so it's going to be a bit faster for me. All right, so in order to be able to use Flask, we need to install this, and I'm going to use pip for this. Pip install Flask. Cool, it is installed. So pip freeze. What we've got here? Not much. Pip freeze requirements txt. So I've saved my installed libraries. Lovely. So we have what we needed. Now we're going to add a new file. We will call this main.py. I need to add it here. And in this main.py, we are going to just use a very simple step for Flask to see if Flask is working. And then if name main, we just start Flask. So let's say Python main.py. It looks like it's working. Let's just see. Let's go here and see what's going to happen. Yes, our little application is working. Now we need to do just a very small thing. We need to wire our user service to the Flask. So that's what we have right now. We have user service, which is able to create and get user. We have user storage abstract class, which is currently using in-memory implementation. Moving on. Now, in the presentation, I'm going to create a new class, and I'm going to call this user controller. And this controller will be responsible for taking requests and everything which is in the Flask, HTTP related, all this sort of stuff, and convert it to something our user service can understand. So let's go to the main.py just for a second. Let's split screen and let's look at the controller. So we're going to have a user subroot. Let's let it be hello world here just to see if it's still working. Let's say that is going to let it to return I'm okay. And this is going to be user. And for the create, we're going to use method post. And since it's taken just post, we don't need to check method. We're going to just create a user. And for this, we're going to call our user controller. Which hopefully is created already. So it's going to be user controller. and this is going to create user, but it also going to take the data that we are providing for the user. I'm feeling very lazy, so we're going to use JSON as the input data, and I don't really want to provide application JSON, so we're going to use request, and it is going to be, what is this? It is going to be get JSON for true. So user data, or just incoming data, is going to be user get JSON, again, force true. And we need to import request here. Now incoming data is just going to go here. So it is just a JSON dictionary at this point. So create user is taking a dictionary, and this create user controller is responsible for transforming this dictionary into our model. So that is the role of a controller in this case. So let's just make this possible. So class user controller, and I'm going to set user service here. So yeah, user service like that. That is better. And now this is going to be none. And now, yeah, let's set it in the constructor, no real harm here. Then I just need to move it here, and I can put it here. Yep, like that. Nice. And I cannot just send incoming data here. What I can do though, I can create a user object. So user is new user. Well, just user. Sorry, that's my Java thing is getting through me. And this user is going to be, so first name, user first name. But instead of this, I'm going to use get, because I want to be able to pass none in case the key is missing. And then, yeah, so this is going to be last name, and that's going to be username. And that's then last name, username. And that is just taking user. And now we want to be able to get user by ID, which should be almost like this, but we don't want to return user as a user object. We need to be able to convert this to JSON. So for this, we will use our lovely JSON library. So get user returns our user, and we want to convert this to JSON. So let's say return user dict. We'll be returning dictionary that we can use at a JSON here. Well, looks good for me. So let's add a method for this. It is user ID, and method should be get. We deleted this. Let's say get user. It takes user ID, and it is just so user data is user controller get user taken get what's going on. And we need to be able to return this as JSON. And Flask is really smart, and it will convert our dictionary into JSON for us. We just need to use the magic JSONify function from Flask. So let's see how it's all working now. I have started my application. Now I need to be able to call this. So let's test an API that we have just written. For this, we're going to use POSTMAN, which is a very common testing tool for testing APIs. So I'm calling my localhost 5000, the root that I've created user, and that's the JSON that I'm providing, username, last name, and first name. So let's send the request, and we are getting some type error. User init missing 3 required positional arguments. Username, okay. So I'm creating a user in a wrong way in some part of the code. So let's find this code and fix this. Oh, actually, I'm just looking at this. So that's where I'm doing this in the wrong way. And finally, it's going to be last name. And I think I can just delete this. Yeah, so now my Flask started in the debug mode, which means every time I update the code, the Flask application will restart and apply the code changes. So let's see, let's send it again. And then the view function for user didn't return a valid response. Either returned none or ended without a return statement. So something did not work right here. So return JSONify. So this one. Yeah. Yes. I'm not returning anything here. And I should be returning. In this case, what usually you do, you usually create yeah, so what's here is going on. So this is returning user ID. And I need to just fill in my user with user ID and return the user. Now, this is getting... Oh, no, I'm not returning the user. I'm using the user dict, so user data. So that's going to be user data, and yeah, return JSONify user data. So essentially the retrieve logic. Let it restart, send. And you see, it didn't work very well, but I have created something. So first name is null, last name is null, null. So yeah, it's not working very well. Okay, the error is really stupid. I just not saving anything in my user here. So we can just fix this really quick. Yeah, that's one is none. This is username. That's last name. So let's create our lovely user. So that is in the nutshell create and retrieve functionality. Well, not true. It's just a create functionality. We haven't yet tested retrieve. For the retrieve, we need to provide an ID, and let's see, our retrieve is not working. And that is because user ID, which we are getting from main, is not an integer, it is a string. So what we need to do is to convert this to integer. But I'm not doing it here. I will do this on the controller level. because it may fail, and I don't want this to fail. So user, for now, I'm going to do just something very simple, like this. I need to create a new user first. Let's create this. I have created a couple of users, and let me just try to retrieve the user with index 1. So get, and yep, I'm getting my user with index 1. So this seems to be working well. So let's see where we are now. We have created a functionality create user, and we, let's say just functionality. So we have create, and we have retrieve. But we can create any user with all sorts of crazy data, with null values, with all these sort of things. So this is not the greatest way. So we need to add input data validation. Add input data validation. And for validation, let's say mandatory fields. So some fields cannot be null, and in our case, let's say it is username and first name. And some fields should be unique. So we cannot have two users with the same username. So username should be unique. So that's our business rules. And for the retrieve, well, for this one, we need to we have to handle incorrect ID. So incorrect ID, either incorrect type or just ID which is not existing, should return 404, not found error. And any of the validation should return 401, I guess. Don't remember. Let me double check. HTTP error codes. Let's see, client error messages. 400, bad request. I think that would be the best one. All right, okay. So that's the next step that we need to implement for create and retrieve. So this functionality looks more or less decent. So the next step that we can do is to change our retrieve logic to return 404 if user ID is incorrect. And what I'm thinking is that to some point it is a business logic. So you get an incorrect user ID and you return in 404. So that's a business logic to some point. To another point though, it is related to presentation because our service is expecting integer as user ID and it might be getting string. So there is a data conversion thing. So I'm trying to think how to distribute this logic properly. And that's, I think, how I do. So let's say user ID integer. So I'm going to convert user ID that I'm getting from the Flask to integer. And if it cannot be converted, I will be returning none. So let's say def false fault save to int, and that gets user ID. Yeah. So this one, and let's make it on the method level. So user ID int and then we are providing here. So now we are converting to int, and we return a none, which is saying there is no valid integer that we are passing to the getUser method. And now the user service getUser can process it. So what we can do here, we can actually add a test for this and see how it's all going to work. Actually, I think of two tests here. Test should handle non-user ID. So for the retrieve, test retrieve getUser. So when you're trying to get user with non-user ID, we expect it to be handled properly. And by properly, I think we can be throwing an exception with self-assert raises. What should it raise? It should raise, let's create a new exception for this, not found error. User not found error. Right. So we need to create this exception. Let's go to the business and create new file. Let's call it exceptions.py, and here we're going to have class user not found exception. Plus. Yep. Going back to the test, let's run it. It's failing, but for the wrong reason, because I haven't imported this. Yep. Running this again. It's still failing, but let's see what is the reason for failure. Yeah, so it is failing with the wrong error. So what we need to do, we need to fix this error. And let's go to the user service. Right, and here our user service trying to get user. I believe that should be handled in the following way. So we need to get user here, and if user is none, we raise user not found exception. Only in this case. But it means that here we need to be able to handle this somehow. And if user ID is none, or user ID is bigger or equals length, we return none. I think it should solve the problem. So what's happening here? We're just checking that we are not getting the wrong user ID. If the user ID is wrong, we are returning none. And our user service, if we cannot get user, it says user not found exception. Let's run our test again. And it should be passing. And now let's do our end-to-end testing. We go here and let's try to access user somewhat. It is saying user not found exception. So essentially, the logic is already working correctly. What we are not doing though, we are not yet bounding this exception to the proper return code. You see it is 500 now, but we can do this. Let's just do that. Here's our user. So what we can do, we can try, because it is throwing error, right? Now accept user not found, and we just return 404 in this case. Oh, it's not error, it's exception. Yeah. Okay. Let's run this again. We go in here and we're trying to get the user, and we get in 404, user not found. Lovely. Let's also just improve this a bit. Let's say we are providing a user ID that it was requested. So we're going to have f string. Oh no, actually, just user ID. Yep. It is restarting. It has restarted, and let's see. So that is requested user ID, user not found. So now we have get user working the way we want, and we need to change the create user operation. And one of the most important things is data validation. We need to validate that the first name is not none, that the user ID is not none, and the user ID is unique. So let's do just that. I again want to start with a test. So I'm going to the test, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a simple test. Let's say create user should create user. Actually, I want to change this to create and get, because there is no sense in calling this again create get. Create user, we are just repeating ourselves. So let me just rename this. Okay, create, and then get, and then in the controller I'm making it get and create. Not allow empty username. Okay, so we have user service. We trying to create user, and let's have a user with the username none. So this should not work. We should see, let's say, invalid user exception. Going to the exceptions, creating this exception here. It is invalid user exception. Good. Going to add this here. Yes, and we are creating user. Create user. Now let's run the test. It should fail because we are allowing creating empty. So it's complaining invalid user exception not raised because we are allowing empty username. So what we need to do, we need to fix this. And to fix this, what I would like to do is to create a new class, which I will call user validator, which will do the validation for me. So new file user validator py. Class user validator validate method validate it takes user and it would return boolean, let's say. And yeah, if username is none or username is empty, return false, and last name we are not verifying. Okay, so now what I need to do is just before creating a user, what we need to do is to check if user is valid. Let's add user validator here. Self user user validator. If yep. Yep. And import. Here it is. If user is not valid, we are going to raise the exception. Let's run the test. Okay. It is complaining because I have not yet imported this. I can fix this pretty easy. Okay, we have an exception here in the user validator. So the problem is in the user validator class, essentially a compilation error, which is fairly easy to fix. Now let's see if it's going to pass. User validator, yeah, self. I have forgotten the self for the user validator, and that's why it was failing. Now I have only this failing, and that's actually interesting, because this, I'm pretty sure it was passing. So let me run here. Okay, so, okay. The thing is trying to assert user for equality, and our user model cannot be properly assert for equality yet. So we just need to check every field. And then it's going to be the first name. Then it's going to be the last name. Okay, a couple of glitches, does not really matter. Okay, let me start this. It should all pass now. And it's still not passing. Because, okay, so the problem is that it is not returning anything here. If user is known, user not found. Yeah, because I'm not returning the user. Okay. Yeah. Let me just fix this. How did I miss it? I'm not quite sure, but maybe I just had broken this somewhere down the road. And good that we had tests. So when we do the refactoring, we can fix this. Now it's all passing. We are all good. The next step that we need to do is to validate the requirements for the uniqueness of the username. So what we need to do, we need to add another test. Test create should not allow non-unique username. So we're going to create user 1 and user 2. And we are creating user 1, which should go just fine. And then when we create in user 2, we should see an exception. Let us run the new test. It is failing because we are not checking for the uniqueness. So for this, what we can do, we can either extend our validator or add another validator. I think extending our validator would be the best way. So let's go to the user validator. What is... So our user validator will need to have access to the storage. So let's create init. And it is taken. Now I need to make sure I'm passing the same storage in both cases. So I will take storage here, and that is a user storage type. And then self storage equals storage. Okay. And now what we're also going to do, if the self storage get find by name, username, then we are returning false in this case. Now we need to implement this, and we need to change the way we create a validator. Okay, so we go into the service. Validator is created from this storage. Right, and now I need to change the storage itself because it doesn't have this method yet. So we need to add this. Find by username, array is not implemented. Yeah, that's look good. And then we go into here and we are going to write information, find by username. For user, yeah, we're just going to iterate over the list of our users, and we will check if we have a user with this username. So this should do. Let me see how our tests are doing. Let me run those. And now they're all passing. So essentially, if I run my system now, not this system. Okay, so now I'm running this, and I'm trying to create the user with the duplicated username. So what's going to happen? Let me put it, send. I have created a user. Now I'm going to create it again. There must be an exception. Yeah, invalid user exception. This exception has to be properly presented on Flask. Let us just quickly change this. So going to the Flask. Where is my user? Yeah, that's what I'm doing. I'm trying to create user data, and then accept invalid user exception, where we're just saying the invalid user data 400. Okay, that looks almost good. We just need to import invalid user, and now this should be all right. Go in here, creating a user. We have created a user, all right. Creating another user, and we get an error, invalid user data. So now we have implemented create and retrieve. Now let's see what classes do we have and how they work with each other. So let's just try to understand what is going on in our code, what kind of classes we have and what they are doing. Right now we have a user controller which is responsible for converting JSON that we get from Flask to data that user service can process, which is a domain model, which I have forgotten to write here. Let me just add here really quick. So it is user class, and I'm going to change the color of this to this. So to the domain model, which is a user and the integer in some cases, and user validator is responsible for validating the user data, understanding if the data is fitting our expectation. User service using user storage to save and get user data, and then all this is replying to user controller. And then it all wrapped by Flask to present an HTTP REST API. Implementing the delete and update functionality would be pretty much similar to the create functionality. So instead of doing this myself, I suggest you to do this yourself. However, in the code repository that is added into the description of this video, you will find the implemented create, retrieve, update, and delete operations. Before looking into the way I have implemented this, I'm suggesting you to implement this yourself. And I'm looking forward to seeing you in my third lecture on the three-layer architecture. In this next lecture, we're going to discuss authentication, how it all works, and also a couple of interesting things related to three-layer architecture and different implementation and code structuring options. Don't forget to hit like button if you enjoyed this video and subscribe to my channel if you haven't yet. Now, the other important thing that I would like to mention, my first course on the software architecture for test automation solutions is now available on Udemy and LeanPub platforms. The links with the biggest discount that I could get for you are in the description to this video. LeanPub link is going to be valid for a year or so since this video is published. Udemy link, unfortunately, is going to be valid only for a month, but that's the way it works on Udemy. If I could make it valid for longer, I would. Anyway, thank you very much for joining me and see you around.